This is episode 335 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and access special insider extras when you sign up to be a patron at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. Sign up today and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Eric Rasmussen, co-editor of the Royal Shakespeare Company's Complete Works of Shakespeare. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
By the 16th century, everybody would have been keeping geese. So Shakespeare would have been completely familiar with geese, both in Stratford and out in Wilmcote. He would have seen geese kept in people's households, people's yards, and he would have seen geese at market. He would have seen them being walked to market.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When we think of the image of William Shakespeare, one of the most famous objects associated with William Shakespeare has to be the quill pen. But was this pen actually made of goose feathers? And if so, how was it made? Of course, the quill pen is far from the only use for geese in the 16th and 17th century, as reflected in the plays, where the bard mentions geese well over a dozen times. And his plays talk about them being taken to market, people getting into trouble for stealing them. And as you might expect, there's even references to plucking feathers. We've seen portraits of 16th century geese being used for elaborate meals, but you may not be as familiar with the process of getting from goose to table, or what kinds of products besides quill pens were made in the 16th and 17th century from geese. And you might even be interested in what kind of people were in charge of overseeing the creation of goose products. Our guest this week is an expert in the history of early modern geese, having performed archaeological research that investigates how geese were kept, what they ate, and their uses in society for Shakespeare's lifetime. We are delighted this week to welcome Dale Serjeanston to the show to share with us the history of the goose for Shakespeare's England. Dale Serjeanston is an archaeologist whose particular interest is in food and the interplay between animals and people in the past. As a zooarchaeologist, her work studies the animal bones from archaeological sites to interpret them in a way that illuminates what people were doing both at the settlement and in society in general at the time. Dale holds a degree in English literature and has studied at the University of St. Andrews, as well as earning her master's at London University before carrying out research at Birkbeck College for the British Museum, Cambridge Archaeological Unit, and others. Now retired, Dale works as an independent researcher, having completed 2 books and several articles on the archaeological remains of birds. You can see more information on Dale's work, her publications, and links to where you can connect with her in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Dale. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. I'm interested to be doing it.
Shakespeare's plays talk about geese in a couple of places. They talk about it being sold at market, and there's also a mention of wild geese in Shakespeare's plays. For the 16th and 17th century, was it more popular to raise domestic geese that you were going to use, or did you go and hunt wild geese, or was there some kind of competition maybe between the two, depending on what you were using the geese for?
Yeah, in lots of ways, they were two completely different things. By the 16th century, a lot of farmers were keeping domestic geese. You could buy domestic geese if you were rich enough. I don't think the poor did, but other people did. And there were huge goose farms. So most people ate domestic geese. Wild geese were probably mostly eaten by the nobility because they would have been caught with falcons, and only the wealthy and the nobility kept falcons. There were ways of catching wild geese, but by far the most that were eaten would have been domestic geese.
what was the process of getting a goose from being a live goose to being on the table in terms of procurement for an individual? I guess I'm wondering if they wanted to eat a goose, for example, did they have to go and get it themselves, or was there a market for it somewhere, like not necessarily a store, I guess, but a market place stall that you could go and buy something from?
Yes, there were markets. Geese were raised in the earlier Middle Ages. They were mostly raised in large flocks on manors. But by the 16th century, peasants were keeping flocks of geese. Sometimes about a dozen geese would be typical for a peasant, and they would all get taken to market. If you had a small number, you might carry them in a cart, but geese were taken to market by the farmers, and they were herded along the road, just like sheep were. And then when they got to market, they might be sold alive or dead.
Now, you alluded to this earlier when you mentioned farmers raising geese, but what about goose products? Now, when you needed geese in a large quantity, I'm thinking about things like goose feathers to make a blanket, or even clothing items that would have utilized goose, for example. What were the commercial farmers who were raising geese at volume? And if they were there, are there any surviving primary documents that tell us about these kinds of geese farms?
Yes, there's a very good article by Philip Slavin about how goose farming worked in East Anglia. And East Anglia was a big centre for raising geese. So the farmers there tended to have huge flocks. But that was a bit earlier in the Middle Ages. That was before the 16th century. And by the 16th century, everybody would have been keeping geese. So Shakespeare would have been completely familiar with geese, both in Stratford and out in Wilmcote. He would have seen geese kept in people's households, people's yards, and he would have seen geese at market. He would have seen them being walked to market. The 5 most important products of geese were their meat, their eggs, the quill feathers that come from the feathers on the end of the wing, their flight feathers, their down, and they were also very good on farms and in yards as guards because they would cackle when people appeared. And out of these, I think quills may well have been the most important in the 16th century.
So goose feathers were used to make quill pins. That's not just something that we've invented for Shakespeare. That was actually what they were used for?
No, they were used for quill pens ever since the 6th century. Up till then, people had used metal styli or reed pens. But from about the 6th or 7th century, they discovered, mostly monks, discovered how successful goose quill feathers were for pens. They just have to be trimmed a little and the nib had to be cut. Well, of course, from that time onwards, the beginnings of literacy in monasteries, monks needed quill pens, and then everybody needed them as literacy increased. So it would have been something with which Shakespeare would have been completely familiar, and he would probably had to have replaced his pens once or twice a day.
So that would have been a reason to raise geese then. If you're having to replace your pen up to twice a day, you need the geese to supply the feathers for this purpose.
That's right. And you didn't only get quill pens from geese that had died, you got them from live geese. Geese molt naturally twice a year. So if you beat them to it and pluck those feathers just before the molting time, you've got a supply of feathers. And farmers not only plucked the quill feathers and sold them, they also plucked the down and sold that because, of course, the down was useful for eider downs and for padding clothing and for bedding.
What kind of enclosure or pen was used to house the geese? So if you walked up on somebody that had one of these farms, what were the recognizable aspects of an animal pen designed for geese rather than other animals?
Well, I'm not an expert on pens, but I have seen pictures in medieval documents and later of how animals were penned. Mostly, the pens were made of wicker, and wicker was made of hazel trees. And the hazel tree, if you cut it down to the ground, it develops several different stems. And these stems, you let them grow for 7 years. That was the classic length of time. And then you cut them back down to the ground again. And that produced a rod of wood, which could be woven into pens for animals, fencing for yards. You even used it in house construction. When I was a child, we lived in a house which dated right back to the 16th century. And when we investigated one of the walls, it had these panels made of hazel rods in it. So I'm sure that would have been the main method by which geese would have been penned. During the day, they wouldn't have lived in their pens. They would have been taken out to eat in the fields, just like sheep. A goose herd would have walked them out onto the green grass to eat, then brought them back at night and penned them.
Were there different kinds of breeds of geese that would have been popular for this time period?
Well, strictly, breeds hadn't really been invented by this time. The definition of animal breeds doesn't really come in till the 19th century, but there were different types of geese. Probably at this time, they were only subtly different. First of all, geese, when they're domestic, they develop white feathers. So a lot of geese would have had white feathers, but a lot of them would still have had the grey feathers that are typical of the wild grey-lag goose, which was the originator of the domestic goose. So at any one time, they would look like a bit of a mixture. So, as I say, technically, I think at this time, there weren't different types. They would have been developed later.
I put that question in this interview for my kids specifically because they were asking me whether or not the Canadian goose, which is very plentiful here where we live, we see them all the time. They wanted to know whether something like that would have been around for Shakespeare. So like when we're thinking of the wild geese, were they something like the Canadian goose, or is there something else that lives in that part of the world?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there were no Canada geese in England. There are now, but there certainly weren't then. No, the wild geese, there were about 4 different types of wild geese in Europe. There's white-fronted goose, bean goose, and so on. And the difference between them and the grey-lag goose, which is the one that the domestic goose was domesticated from, is that they were migratory. They migrated every year. So Britain was a good place for geese to winter. So they would fly into England, the coast of England usually, to spend the winter, the wild geese, and then they would fly away again in the spring. So if you were eating wild geese, you were always eating wild geese between autumn and spring, because that was when they were present in Britain. But the grey-lag goose, it might have migrated, but once you domesticated it and gave it lots of food and plucked the feathers that it used to fly with, it couldn't fly away again. And so they were there all year round.
In her archaeological work, Dale has uncovered evidence of early modern geese. Dale, tell us about what evidence you found specifically at your dig at Winchester, and what did this evidence reveal about the geese from Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, this is the fun about archaeological evidence, because to some extent it supports what we know from the historical evidence, and it augments it, and occasionally it contradicts it. In Winchester, it was a bit of everything. There were a lot of goose bones. Most of them came from places where geese had been eaten, which is what you would expect, because that's what most archaeological animal bones do come from, the remains of food. And so they would have bits of all parts of the skeleton. Some of them would be cut marked, some of them would have been butchered, some of them would have been dropped on the ground and the dogs would have got at them. But in Winchester, what we also discovered, and a lot of other people have discovered it, is that most of the bones came from adult geese, which shows that people were mostly eating geese in the autumn and later, when they were fully adult. And by the 16th century, just a few of them were coming from young geese. These are the ones that people called green geese, and they were killed earlier in the year. They were killed in the spring when they were about 12 weeks old. Then they had produced their first crop of feathers, and they may or may not still have had a skeleton that looked slightly immature. Incidentally, I discovered in the research for this that in Love's Labour's Lost, Ferdinand talks about green geese when he's referring to the spring, and he talks about them breeding he doesn't technically mean a breeding. He can't have done. He must have meant that just that they were around the place and they were feeding and they'd been born and they were breeding. And so they were around the place. But I was quite amused to see that technically that was actually slightly wrong.
Yes, I was going to ask about that because I knew it couldn't have meant a goose that was actually the color of green. So it meant that they were new and only just arrived. So these would have been.
Yes.
Is it a synonym for baby geese or
yes,
is it
for
just
young geese? Yes.
Yeah, any kind of young geese. Okay.
Yes. And green geese were not green colored geese. They were geese that had been eating green grass, because the geese that were killed in autumn were known as stubble geese, and they had been eating the seeds that had been left among the stubble after the harvest. And this stubble used to fatten the geese up, and that was the time of year when the older geese were killed. But for a real delicacy, you ate green geese, which had been feeding on lovely green grass in the spring.
So it's grass-fed meat from the 16th century.
Exactly, yes. And highly organic.
Yes, the best of meat. I can see where that would have been highly prized.
Yeah.
Slender in Merry Wives of Windsor talks about his father stealing geese from a pen. And then Launce from Two Gentlemen of Verona mentions that he, quote, "I have stood on the pillory for geese he hath killed," end quote. Now, a pillory is the wooden platform also known as the stocks, where your head and arms are fixed in a bent-over position, and it was used as a public form of punishment. Dale, was geese stealing a common crime in Shakespeare's England, and was being put in the stocks the typical punishment like Launce is talking about in this play?
Well, as far as I know, being put in the stocks was a typical punishment. You probably know as much about this as me. There was a medieval ordinance, what was it, that unruly artisans had to be put in the stocks as a punishment. So I guess he was an unruly artisan. I think it's rather charming that he was the one who suffered when his dog killed a goose. Now, geese stealing, I don't know how prevalent it was. You would need to ask a different type of historians, someone like Christopher Dyer, who has done a lot of work on peasants in the Middle Ages. But geese would have been fairly easy to steal. If you think of it'd be very difficult to steal a cow or a sheep. But a geese would have been very easy to steal and quite valuable, more valuable than a chicken, almost as easy to steal if you could stop them cackling.
So we can feel bad a little bit for poor Launce, who got punished for the antics of his dog.
Yes.
Well, I know we would love to learn more about geese from Shakespeare's lifetime and all of the history that you've been sharing with us here today. From your research, where would you suggest that we start? If we're new to this topic and we don't know where to begin, where would you suggest we start?
Well, for people interested in Shakespeare, the best source on agriculture is Thomas Tusser, which is a wonderful farmer's compendium in verse. For finding out about geese, wild and domestic, there's a very nice new naturalist's book by Janet Keir called Man and Wildfowl. And that's about the history of wild and domestic geese. It's quite old now, and of course it doesn't include any archaeological evidence. And there's also a tome by a Frenchman on medieval agriculture, which has a good history of domestic geese. And there's a history of domestic animals. But none of those histories of geese they're mostly not up to date enough to include much archaeological evidence. And there's one very good study about the different importance of geese and ducks by my colleague Umberto Albarella, professor in Sheffield, and which shows you how geese became much more important in the Middle Ages. And as I've suggested, I think it's probably as much for the quills as for the meat. I wrote a historical and archaeological account of geese in a book I wrote for the Cambridge series Manuals in Archaeology, and it's just called Birds because it covers a lot of practical aspects of studying bird bones as well as the history of birds. And there's a big section on geese there. And I've just a year ago finished a book on birds in Britain. And that's a survey of the archaeological evidence from the end of the last ice age to the 17th century. Of course, it covers nearly every species, but there's also a section on the history of domestic geese in Britain, and especially geese in the late Middle Ages.
These are excellent resources. I am fascinated by ducks. I think are in my top 3 most favorite animals, and I am learning to love geese. And they're certainly more entertaining for all of the history that we have studied here. And I will place links to not only these references that Dale has suggested here today, but she sent over a list of resources for you if you're interested in the medieval goose or the geese from Shakespeare's lifetime. And I will include that entire list with citations and links in the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Dale, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be boring, but it would have to be either Middlemarch or Jane Austen's works. I would need fiction on a desert island. I don't want fact.
I think that is a completely good choice. I think I would want to focus on being entertained and staying positive while I was on a deserted island too. And Jane Austen is never a bad choice.
Yeah.
So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm currently working on a study of the birds that people ate in monasteries in the Middle Ages for a collection of papers to be published by Oxbow. And after that, I'm going to expand my scope a bit and work on a chapter for a Bloomsbury volume on birds, the consumption of birds in the early Middle Ages. And that's going to take me beyond Britain. So I'm looking forward to doing the research on what was happening, learning a bit more about what was happening in the west of Europe and maybe even beyond, if I'm allowed enough words.
I think that sounds fabulous. Well, I certainly have enjoyed exploring your research and reading the articles and chapters that we've explored for this episode. And certainly getting to talk to you today is our honor and pleasure to get to speak with you about the history of geese in Shakespeare's lifetime. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here and share it with us.
Yeah, thank you, Cassidy. I enjoyed it.
If this trip into the 16th century to explore the life of geese from Shakespeare's England has you as excited as I am to explore what geese were like from the 16th and 17th century, you can start with Dale's recommended reading list that's available right now in the show notes for today's episode. On the show notes page, you can also find links to Dale's publications on geese from the 16th century and more information on where you can connect with her if you'd like to see more about the work that she's been doing. Find all of these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 335. And while you're there, if you'd like to see visual history related to geese in Shakespeare's lifetime, including paintings of 16th century geese, examples of some of the hazel tree pens that we were talking about, samples of recipes that were used to cook geese, and even some archaeological records donated to our show by Dale Serjeanston specifically just for you, then you'll want to explore the detailed show notes. On our regular show notes page, you'll see a Patreon button that allows you to either sign up and join us as a patron or use that button to log in using your Patreon credentials if you're already a supporter of our show. And all of the bonus history content related to today's show will expand right there on the page. Again, that URL for today's bonuses is CassidyCash.com/episode 335. That's CassidyCash.com/EP335. That Shakespeare Life is completely free to listen here each week, and your support makes that possible. Support That Shakespeare Life by becoming a patron on Patreon. Patrons get special bonuses like our detailed show notes every week, along with video versions of the podcast and the opportunity to have your hand in how the show is made, with sneak peeks at upcoming episodes and the chance to submit your questions you'd like to have asked during an interview. Join us today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.